Welcome to Into the West, a Middle-earth strategy battle game podcast. My name is Charles. With me today are Richard, Ian, and a special guest, Andrew.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey Andrew, welcome back to the podcast. Today we will be talking about one of the armies that Andrew loves to play, the Army of Laketown.
I believe, Andrew, you were on for the Survivors of Laketown episode.
I was, yeah, and I'm trying to remember. I think I was on for the Bard the Bowman episode, so I think I actually gave you guys a Survivors Alliance list and then another list with Bard in Army of Laketown. So I might have talked about some of this already, but I don't think we've done a deep dive yet. But I absolutely love the Army. I feel like when I was getting started, I wanted to pick an army that I thought was competitive, that I didn't see anybody playing in my local scene. And everyone at my local scene tends to favor like Lord of the Rings armies, which I think is pretty popular in most spots. So I figured that Laketown would be like a really fun and competitive list to get started with. And I would say I have more games under my belt with Survivors and Army of Laketown than any other force in the game.
Okay, you're the expert.
Over here on the west coast of Canada, we actually don't see Army of Laketown or Survivors all that much. I brought Army of Laketown to a couple tournaments in the last couple of years, but I don't think I've really seen Army of Laketown around.
On the East Coast, at least in the US, I don't want to say it's pretty popular, but I'd say there's a pocket of players that are known for doing like yellow alliances with Army of Laketown. I know the DC Hobbit League guys have talked about it a lot on their podcast. Just because you can get so many troops and they have a decent amount of yellow allies, so you can kind of take these really big heroes and still get a really high troop count at kind of, 600 to 800 points to kind of pair with other troops. So Alisher, who, has won Nova, he's one of our most competitive players on the East Coast out of Philly. We ran a local event probably, in October, and he brought a yellow alliance, with Army of Laketown. So that's pretty common on the East Coast, I'd say.
So just to break down this episode, we'll be going over the army list, what is in the Army of Laketown, and we'll be giving our thoughts on the army. And then Andrew has brought two army lists to share with us today, one pure army list and one alliance.
I just wanted to take a second to thank all our patrons. You guys are awesome. If you guys want extra content, you can check out the Patreon link in the description below. Now, back to the video.
So going through the profile, the Army of Laketown is from the armies of the Hobbit, and in the army you have Bard the Bowman, the Master of Laketown, Alfred the Counselor, Braga, Captain of the Guard, Bane, Son of Bard, Sigurd and Tilda, Laketown Guard Captains, and you have your one warrior, Laketown Guard. The army bonus is the Master's Purse Strings. The Master of Laketown's money bag special rule has a range of 12 inches rather than 6 inches. So the Master is kind of your key hero in this army. He provides the money bag special rule, which it gives him an option to spend a point of might each turn to basically create a 6-inch banner effect around him that also gives a +1 fight value to Laketown Guard, Laketown Guard Captains, and Braga. As you guys know, with the combination of Alfred, he can be boosted with even more might than the 2 might that he starts with. So with the army bonus, this bubble is basically increased to double the area effect. Go ahead.
I just think that's really, really crazy because I would say in most games, even in like an 800 points match, you're not going to get more than like 4 or 5 turns of combat. So, essentially you're just going to pay 50 points for like a 12-inch banner and a +1 fight. That's just insane.
The fight value buff here is really big because like bringing the Laketown Guards up to fight 4 is bringing them up to like the higher end of like average armies, and against most evil armies it's going to be tying or beating them, which is huge, especially when you have like that big of a bubble of rerolls.
I agree with everything that you guys said. The most important part of this army and that army bonus is, a Laketown Guard is 5 points. So if you give them a bow, it's 6 points, right? So I'm pretty sure that would be the cheapest fight for in the game, right? Because I think a Corsair is like 8 or 9 points. The other Fight 4 troops I can think of are like low double-digit points, Fountain Court Guard, stuff like that. Even an elf is like 10, 11 points for Fight 5. So to me, that's the real value, is if you're just, an analytical player like me who's trying to look at just the stats and the math and figure out what the most efficient kind of troop for the points is. With that buff, I mean, Fight 4 with a reroll for the entire board, because 12 inches is the entire board, unless you're, playing some wacky, Command the Battlefield, where you have to go into the 4 corners or something like that. And even still, you might get it if he's standing in the middle. That's extremely strong. I think if you have that for 6 points, granted it's temporary. And one thing that I think a lot of people forget is it's actually an active rule, the money bags. So if he gets transfixed, you actually can't use it. And that's really crucial. I've seen people, mess that up before. But that's like a corner case scenario, right? That's the whole gimmick of the army, is using that money bag special rule and, using Alfred to give him extra might so that he can do it, 5 times a game if you really need to. That's the army. That's the whole, gimmick of the army. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but basically if Fight 4 with a reroll is good, you probably win. If you're up against, elves or Dragon Emperor Legion, you probably lose. Like, I know that's oversimplifying, but that's kind of how this army works. You have one troop type. Your heroes are all support heroes unless you ally them in. So the strategy that I use with these guys is to play them at lower points. I think they do best around 500. I would play them up to like 600 or 650 with allies. And then after that, I just think survivors are the clear top choice, because you have 2 great alliances with Thranduil's Halls and 3 great alliances, Erebor Reclaimed and Iron Hills, where you can just get better troops, better heroes that you can't really get with this list. And then, you're not really aiming for that Fight 4 horde anymore. You're trying to just build a different list, right? Maybe you're allying elves for Fight 5, or some more powerful heroes like Thranduil for magic support. So at lower points though, like we'll walk through one of the lists that I put together, like unless you're coming up against Fight 5, and even if you are, you might have double, if not more than double, the troops your opponent has. So this army's got a lot going for it. I think people overlook it because it's very simple. It's like 2 pages in the book, right? It's just a couple profiles, right? I don't think people really like this army from the Hobbit movies. I totally understand that. But if you're just looking for like a strong army to play that has a ton of replayability, this is the best army in the game for that. Like, you can play it up to any points level and be like, hey, I want to put Gandalf the White in today. Great, throw him in. I want to put, Galadriel in today. Great, throw him in. Like, it's really cool because there's so many like ways you can mix and match different heroes. If you want, Gwahir and Galadriel with the mirror combo, throw it in. It's super easy, right? And then you just have 40 something troops at 650 or 700 points. And, I think people overlook this army a little bit. I think it's a lot more competitive than people think. And I'll say I usually win like easily or get absolutely destroyed with this force. And I think having, the right heroes allied in it as a yellow alliance, I think can take this force from good to excellent and help fill in some of those gaps. And you also have like, even at low points, like 13, 14, 15 bows at like 500 points. So even just that is pretty strong. So I think it's boring to build the list. You've got, one troop type and just a few heroes that you're going to use every time, but it's super effective, I think.
The Master of Laketown being only 50 points is a reason why you can ally him into so many lists, because that Hero Valor, that super cheap with 15 warband slots. I mean, if you take the 3 main heroes, Alfred, Braga, and the Master, that's only 120 points. And you'll get over 40 models with those 3 just maxed. So it's really easy to kind of slot them into many alliance lists. And I brought it to a couple of tournaments, and just on paper, it doesn't look like a fun army to play because, your leader is unarmed and, all your warriors are basically the basic kits. You don't have access to cavalry or anything, and it's just very bare bones. But every time I brought it to a tournament, it's been a lot of fun. And I agree that the banner effect cannot be underestimated because you have just so many models. I find that it's the most effective when you try to have as many one-on-ones as you can, because every time you have a one-on-one, you're most likely rolling double the dice of your opponent because you get a banner reroll. For a defense 4 army, it can actually be quite tough.
You say it's a fun army. I think the fun part is that your opponent is not going to have fun.
It's fun for you. It's not fun for me.
You roll up to a 500-point match with 60 plus models. Like the fun is looking at your opponent's face.
Yeah.
We are, in fact, outnumbered.
The fun is shooting 20 bows every turn. I have a question for those of you who have used this list. Has the Master of Laketown's Dragon Sickness rule, where he can get bribed away from the battlefield, has that ever happened to you before?
It's never happened to me. I always remind my opponent of it because I think it's the right thing to do, and it's just never come up. I mean, like, at the points levels that I play this army, if you're going to get through like 30, 40 models in an hour and a half game, like, good for you, man. Like, you beat me, like, that's fine, fair and square. But I don't even know if he's ever been in combat in a game that I've played.
You serious?
Never played contests with this list, but I don't think he's ever seen combat, right? I have him a couple rows back. He's unarmed, right? So even though he's got strength 4, you don't want him fighting. And you just really want to make sure he's within 6 inches of Braga, because Braga has a special rule where if he's within 6, he gets free heroic actions on a 4+ if he's within 6 of the master. I want to talk a little bit about Braga. I mean, Charles, I don't know what your experience was playing with him, but I think you could argue he's one of the best heroes in the game for 50 points. He's got, comes with 3 might. He's got heroic march and heroic defense, and he can do both of those for free on a 4+ if he's nearby the master. We'll talk about this when we talk about the alliance list, but what I like to try and do is partner him up with a more fighty hero and try and get free heroic combats on a 4+. I really like doing that. So he's kind of like the hype man for the army. He's like, I'm not going to do a whole lot, but that guy right there, he's going to heroic combat, So I think, Richard, you're right. Like, if you come across this against this at a tournament, you can be like, oh my God, there's so many troops. But this army doesn't instill fear in anyone. Like, I don't think anybody who like, your opponent rolls up and has 50 Army of Laketown, like, I don't know that you care. Like people constantly underestimate this list when I play it, and I think that's such an advantage because there's not a ton to think about, right? There's one troop type, what the heroes do, that they're just there to buff. So I don't know, it kind of lulls your opponent into a little bit of like a false sense of security, and then you're just like, cool, I'm just gonna sit here and like Charles said, roll twice the amount of dice that you are with my crappy 6-point troops that are just better than your 10-point troops in some cases. And I don't know, it's unassuming. So the army winds up doing a lot better than I think you'd expect. And those are my favorite types of armies to play. Like, I'm never going to play the top, most obvious, most competitive force. I like playing armies like this where, your opponent's like, okay, great. Like, I'm on to the next round with a win. And then they're like at the end, oh my God, like, what happened? I really, got beat up by this list.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Like, I don't think it's popular enough that people are like intimidated by it. But once you get smashed a couple of times by it, then, you start not having fun. But I do agree with you 100%. I think Braga is actually one of the most underrated heroes in the game. And the thing is, like, there's podcasts and there's blogs and stuff about like top heroes in the game. I almost never see Braga there, but he's legitimately probably easily top 5 and, arguably the best. So that's a really good shout out.
Definitely agree with you guys. For 50 points, I think he's an auto include, and I actually might even put him above Alfred. Although most of the time you just take all 3, but yeah, he's amazing.
It's not a big thing, but I wouldn't sleep on the fact that Braga and the Laketown guard captains can get up to fight 5 when they are in that buffing aura. For a list like this, that could actually be pretty big, just to add that extra little bit of durability to your combat line and a little bit of extra punch because of their strength 4. Considering, once you get to like 600 points, you're going to have Braga and 2 captains probably if you're not allying. So you don't want to forget about that.
Yeah, that's a really good shout out, Ian. And the other thing is they also get the banner. So they get the +1 fight and the banner effect, just like the regular troops. So you have fight 5 and, your 2 attacks go up to 3. Again, it's not much, but if you're playing this at the points level that I kind of recommend, you won't really be coming up against something that's going to smash your heroes. I mean, the obvious weakness here is like no heroic strike, right? So this is a little bit of a different army play style than I think the standard. You know, if you're up against a Gil-galad, right, your solution is let him kill 2 or 3 troops a turn, right, and position so that he can only get into 1 after the heroic combat and make him waste his might, and that's 30 points, right? Your solution to big heroes is avoidance and trying to use your troops to kind of kill their troops. So it's a little bit different. But again, you've got 20 bows, right? Take Gil-galad off his horse. Like you have tools with this list. I think it's just a little bit different than a normal list. But that's a really good point, Ian. Like fight 5 with the banner, I mean, against some armies that's pretty strong. And even if you just have Braga like going into, you know, fight 4 or less troops and trying to call a heroic combat to get a couple extra kills, like it really does add up.
I think courage is a big weakness of this list, especially as you scale up in points. So all your troops are courage 2 and your heroes are, I think for the most part, 3. Not very reliable at all. And I remember bringing this to a 500 or 600 point tournament once, and the person I didn't want to face the most on the list was Richard, because he had the Watcher in the water. And just the thought of my Army of Laketown having to make courage test on a -1 to charge the Watcher, I just thought that I wouldn't really have a chance against his list. So I think that's a big thing to consider when taking this list, especially if you're going above a certain level where you're going to see a lot of terror. It's not easy to deal with.
That's definitely a huge weakness of the list. I think for me, if I have an army that doesn't have any kind of possibility to mitigate terror, I think one of my favorite solutions is just having a ton of bows, right? Because it's like, okay, I won't charge you. If you want to sit there all day, I'll fire 20 shots with these archers that are just as good as Gondorian archers, as Haradrim. Like, they're just human archers. They're just as good. So for 6 points, you've got a 4+ shoot with a strength 2 bow. So look, that's not the only solution, right, Charles? But you typically have a lot of troops. And, you know, what I've found, if I do come up at 500 points against like, Mordor with Black Numenorians or something like that, it's like, great, I'm going to put 20 shots into your Witch King on Fellbeast. If you want to sit back the whole game, great, I'm going to win. And if not, you're going to have to move forward and charge me. And then I can position, my spears to come in and kind of even up the fight. The other weakness here, which we haven't talked about, is no shields. There are no shields in the army. That's one thing that really benefits survivors of Laketown that this army doesn't have. So if you're in a situation where you need to stall the game and you don't want to, get your opponent to 25%, that's a big negative of this army, right? So you don't have the ability to mitigate damage if you really need to. So I'd say those are kind of the key weaknesses. And again, that's why I like to play this army at kind of the lower points level. 500 points, I just think is like absolutely miserable to play against. My 650 list actually has some mitigation of some of the weaknesses we talked about. So I'm looking forward to talking about them.
One more thing that I want to bring up, and I know, Andrew, you had a lot of experience with this army, but I just want to ask you, what do you think of the idea that the army relies on how much might the master has and how long he has the buff up for? One game that I played with him, Alfred rolled 2 1s, so nearly cost me the game because I had to choose very carefully which turns my army got the buff. So it feels like your army is playing on borrowed time, and when they're all strength 3, sometimes it can be hard to whittle down your enemies with just a limited amount of turns.
That's the whole gimmick of the army, right? Like the turn that you run out of might on the master, unless maybe you're up against fight 2 like Goblin Town or something like that, like you're done, right? That's been my experience. To me, it's almost like very different armies, so take this with a grain of salt. It's almost like Riders of Theoden, right? Like if you don't call death at the right time, break your opponent and end the game quickly, like you lose, right? Like that's the whole point of the army. So I think if you get a single one, I think it's okay, because to Richard's point, like, combat's usually kind of 4 to 5 rounds. If I were to roll 2 1s, I would probably sit back as long as I could and try to whittle my opponent down with shooting and just play avoidance for a bit. And then when we get close, just hope for like one big turn to maybe break and get my opponent off the board. But yeah, it's a big challenge and it's a risk of the list. I mean, on the other hand, if I get 3 rolls that are not 1, 2+, as long as I'm not up against certain armies, I almost feel like I've won. I know that's like aggressive to say, but if you're up against a fight 3 army that has half the models that you have, and you have 5 turns of fight 4 with the banner, like you should be winning that every time, unless your opponent has some type of trick to outdo you. So that's why I say like this army snowballs really hard or gets stomped, really hard. Because think about it, right? If you're up against Dragon Emperor Legion, you have no way to deal with their heroes, any of them. So they're killing a ton of your troops every turn. And they have a fight 5 horde with, less troops than you, but your fight 4 doesn't do much and your strength 3. So I think that's probably the worst matchup for this army in the game that I've come up against. You have worse fight. If you win the fight, you're not likely going to kill them. And you have no way to deal with the big heroes that, in my opinion, are the way to kind of counteract that army. So yeah, it's tough. Like I think this is an army where if you're taking it to a 2-day tournament, you're probably going to come up against a matchup where you have a really hard time winning. If you come up against like a 1-day tournament and you have the right matchups, I feel like you can easily 3-0 and podium if you know what you're doing. So it's tricky. It's a swingy army. I think it's got play against everything, but there's certain matchups where you're just like, okay, I'm going to have to get lucky, honestly, and this is going to be a real kind of tough go.
Just to give our final verdicts, what would you rate this army out of 10?
I think I'd say like maybe 600 or 650 and below, a 9. And I think kind of 650 plus, I would drop it down to probably like a 6.5 or 7. If you hit the right points level with this, I think it's one of the most competitive armies in the game. Like I think at 500, this might be a 10 for me. But just holistically, like at the points levels that most people play at, which is like 600 and 800, don't think I would bring it at 800 unless I was doing some wacky alliance. And at 600, I would feel really confident that I could win a tournament with it. So it's kind of tricky. It's one of those lists that I think has a peak at a certain points level. So yeah, I'd say probably 9, maybe 9.5, 650 or 600 and below. And then above that, I think it really drops off. So you'd have to go Yellow Alliance. And I'd say even with that, you could probably make better armies. So 6.5, 7.
I think I'll go with a 9, maybe a 9.5 all the way around. And I agree with Andrew on the low points, but like we all know, I am a Yellow Alliance guy, so I really like the flexibility here and the stuff that you can do with it. I haven't had the chance to build it just yet. I do have a Survivors of Laketown list, but I've played against Charles's Army of Laketown, and yeah, there's a lot of ally options that you can get, even if you want to go a bit simple and just grab a few Thorn's Company. Like, that's not even anything crazy, but that really just ups the list quite a bit too. Just throw in a couple fighty striking heroes. So yeah, I like it all the way around, even at high points.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna give it an 8, maybe an 8.5. Just overall, for the reasons that kind of for the reasons that Richard just mentioned, like going the Yellow Alliance route means you do lose your huge banner buff, and you only get a big banner buff, which is still really good. But the fact that you can go into Thorn's Company and get fighty heroes or heroes that can do damage, I mean, they're not the best, but the fact that you can get some ones that are reasonable and still keep your huge banner bonus is a lot, because it does help cover the big weaknesses of the list. So yeah, I think overall I'd still rate it pretty highly.
I think I'll go 9 as well. If you were talking strictly pure list, maybe a little bit lower at high points, but the fact that you can still use them at high points, you can ally, as we'll see in Andrew's list, where you could just drop in a couple of warbands of really cheap models. It's really flexible in all points levels. So a solid 9 from me.
I just want to point out before we move on that, like, if I said Ian, Charles, Richard, like you're coming up in the final round of your tournament to win the whole thing against a 9 out of 10 army, right? You'd be like, that's horrible. Like, I feel like this is going to be really tough for me to win. I know Dragon Legion is 12 out of 10, but that's still pretty tough. What am I going to do, right? And then just think about everything we just said, right? If I came up to you guys top table and put Army of Laketown down, you'd be like, I've got this. Like, I'm winning the tournament. I feel great. Like, I feel like we need a half a point adjustment just for that lack of fear factor. Like maybe now you guys will think about it differently, but it's so valuable. It's just like an army, like almost like Survivors, but I think that's way more popular, so people have figured it out. But there's definitely value in just like how underestimated this list is.
Unless the final round is domination, and Ian is playing Army of Laketown, so we know he's a slow player. So it's going to be like 3 turns, and I can't kill 60 models in 3 turns.
Could you go any slower?
Okay, let's move on to the 2 army lists that Andrew brought to share with us today. So we're going to start with the pure list. Andrew, why don't you go over what's in the list and your general strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, this one's 500 points. This is going to be a reoccurring theme, but Warband 1 is Master of Laketown. He's actually not fully maxed out. He's got 3 regular guard, 3 with spear, and 3 with bow. Next up is Alfred the Counselor. He's got 4 regular, 4 with spear, 4 with bow. Braga, Captain of the Guard, 4 regular, 4 spear, 4 bow. And then a Laketown Guard Captain. He's got 3 regular, 3 spear, 3 bow. And another Laketown Guard Captain, he's got 4 regular, 3 spear, 4 bow, just to make the points work. So that's 500 points even. That's 58 models. I don't really play 800 points, but I think I would outnumber most competitive 800 point forces at 500 points. So I just want to, like, before I even get into the strategy, like, I have 58 models with Fight 4 at 500 points. Like, I don't know that I really need to get into a detailed strategy analysis here. I'm happy to do so, but like, that's the power of this list, right? I think 500 points is maybe the strongest level for this army, maybe like 550, but nobody really plays that. You have 18 bows in this list, and then a Fight 4 horde, right? So like at 500 points, I'm expecting my opponent's army to be what, like 25 models on average, something like that. I mean, the game could be over in 2 turns, right, of just me shooting.
Our arrows will blot out the sun.
I know this sounds like a little bit like I'm oversimplifying it, but this is such a strong list at those points levels. You also don't have to worry about a lot of the big things that are weaknesses for this list. It's pretty unlikely that you'll come up against a terror wall. Even if you were to come up against like Return of the King, you should be able to whittle them down with shooting. And then, you know, use the tactics that I mentioned earlier. Also not a really common list at 500 points. You're probably not going to come up against a big hero. And actually, I would argue if you do, I think you're more likely to win, because if someone's spending 200 points on Gil-galad, they're probably closer to 20 models instead of 30. And I mean, look, it's a dice game, right? Like, you want to mitigate variance if you want to win and play a competitive force. 18 bow shots per turn is mitigating variance, and then 58, models with pretty high fight is mitigating variance. So we don't play 500 points locally, so I've taken a similar version to this at like 650, and it's done really well. I came up against Easterlings, and that was, a loss for me. But other than that, I think I've won all my games with this army at low points. So, that's general strategy, right? Is if I have the opportunity to sit back and shoot, I'm going to do that. And if I can break my opponent, I'm going to do that. And anything like hold ground, domination, like, I'm just going to run up to the objectives. Like, there's no way my opponent will have more models on them or be able to kill enough in time. So it's an interesting gameplay style, right? And then even like Goblin Town, which is the only one who might be able to outnumber you, they don't want to be taking 18 bow shots a turn, and they'll kind of melt in combat against this horde with the rerolls and the Fight 4. You can also feint with the Laketown Guard, so you can reroll 1s to wound, which is kind of like one of the weaknesses in combat here, as long as you have the fight value buff and the spear supporting. And then other than that, really just, we mentioned the synergies with the heroes earlier in the show. So what do you guys think of this one?
It's gross. I mean, well, like you said, like just this pure model count and therefore the number of bows you have is pretty nasty. My standard Rivendell list with Gil-galad at 500 is like 22 models. I think my Thranduil's Halls one had 24 models, right? And your average model count at 500 is going to be 25 models. So the fact that you, against a defense 6 army, you're likely to drop, 4 to 6 models at least before combat starts, like that's a huge portion of the army just gone, and you just swamp them.
Come to Papa!
Yeah, it's pretty gross unless they have terror. But even with terror, you have so many models, it's likely not going to make that much of a difference.
Yeah, I know Ian didn't give his rating, but I can give it for him. I can speak on behalf of Ian. Easy legend. You had him at the bows.
Agreed.
I really like this list as well. Like I said, maybe because I've played against something like this, it's definitely not unassuming for me. I don't want to play this in the final round. I think maybe the only weakness I would see is if a scenario calls for, for you to target a specific hero. If you somehow can't get your bow shots in, or, you're playing an experienced player who is able to protect their heroes, you don't really have a strong hitter like that, like in a game like Assassination, or, Fog of War isn't that bad because there's the objective part of the scenario where you can do very well at, but maybe like a Clash by New Moonlight, but yeah, you do have a lot of bows. So not that many scenarios off the top of my head that you're weak at, but I guess there's always going to be a few. But yeah, I think at 500 points, this is as well-rounded as you can get. Perhaps your only real weakness is the time. You don't want to get timed out at a tournament. But otherwise, yeah, I would say this is easily a hero of legend.
Question I had for you is, you mentioned that Master of Laketown's warband is not maxed out. So for me, he would actually be the first warband that I would max out, especially if it's like Maelstrom of Battle. You definitely want as many models in his bubble as possible. Just wondering what your train of thought was behind that.
I think you could really mix and match them and max them out if you want. I think that's one weakness that we didn't talk about earlier in the segment, but Maelstrom is pretty tough for this army, especially because Alfred technically has no might. So you want Braga close to the Master, you want Alfred close to the Master. But the counter to that is you have so many warbands. So my strategy in Maelstrom is actually to deploy Alfred first, right? And then if you need to use might on the Master or Braga or any of the captains, you can keep them close together. And you really don't want Alfred picked off, right away. So I definitely wanted to max his warband out. And other than that, it was really just trying to spread out the troop count as much as I could. But yeah, you could definitely throw, a few more troops into the Master's warband if you wanted.
I played a list like this with the exception I allied in Nori from Thorin's Company for a little bit of hitting power. Just gave me a heroic strike, but really similar idea. And there's a lot of lists at this points level where you'll just roll up with this list and it'll just seem really easy to play against, like you said. So hero of legend for me. So let's move on to the second list you brought for us today, your alliance list.
Yeah, sure. So the next one is a yellow alliance. And this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, where because the Master is a hero of valor, you can ally in a number of different heroes from other lists. So I've got the 3 key heroes. I've got the Master. He's fully maxed out. So 5 regular guys, 5 bowmen, 5 spearmen. Alfred is fully maxed out with 4 regular guys, 4 bowmen, 4 spearmen. And then to make the points work, Braga has 5 regular guys, 3 spearmen, and 4 bowmen. So still max bows, but I was over by 1 point, so dropped a spear on one of the guys. And then the leader of the force from the White Council is Saruman the White on horse. And also from the White Council is Galadriel, Lady of Light. So that's 650 points. I believe that is, I didn't write it down. I think it's 44 models, if I remember correctly. So 650, I have 44. At 500, I had 58. But this is why I think this is kind of the tipping point for me. I wouldn't want to go above here. I kind of like the 650 point range for this army as kind of the cap. I know you guys felt differently, but I don't play a ton of 800, so you might be right. To me, this is such a sweet spot. The inspiration for this list was kind of twofold. The first was I was really trying to find the optimal list for Lady of Light after the FAQ took her from Valor to Fortitude. And it's pretty tough. I think if you wanted to ally her into Rivendell, which is a Green Alliance, you're losing out on a lot of troop count because she can't bring any troops into that list. So I thought that this would be kind of the perfect list to bring her in, just because you get a really high model count and you have a lot of archers. So in this one, I still have 13 bows, which is still pretty strong. And now you have the 6-inch, pseudo blinding light bubble from Lady of Light. You get a heroic striker with her as well. So you're mitigating some of the weaknesses that we talked about earlier. And to me, I think Saruman the White on horse, this is the absolute perfect army to ally him into. We talked about courage being a problem before, right? He's got the aura of command. And then just having that flexibility to, we didn't talk about this earlier, but cavalry is also a big weakness of this list. So he both is a cavalry model to counter charges, but also has sorceress blast to take people off their horses. And what I like about this list is it's extremely well-rounded. I don't think there's a single matchup I would go into and feel like I didn't have a chance to win, even against the fight 5 hordes. Now I have Galadriel who I can put into 2 troops a turn to try and take them out. She's not my leader, so obviously I can be pretty aggressive with her. And then if you come up against the right list, I feel like this army just really, really wrecks it. On the East Coast, a couple really popular lists are Mordor allied with the Spider Queen. That's very common. And so is Angmar. Those are probably 2 of the more competitive lists we see all the time, at Nova and on the East Coast. So having Galadriel, especially now where I think people have kind of let their guard down on her, and we've seen a lot of evil armies really kind of dominating the meta on the East Coast, at least in the States. I kind of feel like this list will catch a lot of people off guard. This also gives me some of the mitigants that you guys pointed out on my last list, right? If I need an assassin now, I have one. If I, need to win Contest of Champions, I can make Saruman kill a few troops. It makes you a more well-rounded list that I think doesn't steamroll as hard as the 500-point one does, but has a little bit more play in kind of every scenario. And like I said, if you come up against that right list with a Witch King as the leader or something like that, both Saruman's magic and Galadriel's, banish, I just think it's huge. And now you will definitely win the shooting war with the blinding light. I haven't played this list since the Assault on Lothlorien became super popular. I don't think that's a great matchup for this one. And I don't know if anything is a good matchup against that based on what you guys have told me. But I love this list. I think it's different. I always try and, like I said earlier, play armies that I haven't seen anybody play, and these are 2 heroes I haven't seen as part of the standard ally into the Yellow Alliance package.
Wow, I think we're all speechless because I think you just covered everything. I mean, what can I say? It's super well-rounded, and this is definitely my type of list. Looking at this, I really, really want to try this list, and I definitely don't say that as much seeing, armies on this podcast, sometimes, but this is really interesting for me because you got the numbers and you have the shenanigans. I'm just really surprised, you got these 2 expensive heroes from the White Council, yellow allied in, and you just still have so much models to fit your core. Yeah, maybe I was too hasty to give the legend in the previous list, but I think this one tops it for me. I really like it.
Yeah, I think the great thing about this list is the army bonus you don't completely lose. You don't lose the money bags rule. So even when you yellow ally, and you could still, 6-inch is still big enough where you could put the master close to where the fighting is the thickest and where the most important combats are. So you're still getting a huge chunk of your battle line with those rerolls and the buff. Locally, we don't really play 650 points, but I can see this type of build also being upgraded at 800 points. If you just ally it, maybe an Elven faction or something to give a bigger variety of troops, higher quality troops. But you could use the Army of Laketown to bump up your models above the average good elite army numbers. And I think they're a really useful tool, and you've shown that here. And I would hate to fight this list at this points level. So, Hero of Legend.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we've ever really played much 650 points. That being said, I am actually going to a 650 point tournament next week. So I'm just kind of thinking about how I'd use my list against this list. And it's not going well for me. Because yeah, I don't know. Like I can't really think of a big weakness that this list has really. Aside from, I guess the Dragon Emperor would probably still give you a run for money, but that's just because of the shield wall itself that it has and the high fight value. But other than that, it is still a very, very solid list of what you have. It doesn't have a lot of big weaknesses. Yeah, I think I'd probably give it a legend. Yeah. Well, okay. The only thing I could think of is defense 6 or defense 7 hordes. I think he would struggle against that.
You already said legend though, so let the record show that you said legend. No takesies backsies, Ian. No, you're right though. I mean, like that's part of the problem with Easterlings, right? Is like you're still just strength 3. So yeah, high defense hordes are really tough, and the support from the 2 casters doesn't really do anything to help you with high defense. So I think that's totally fair. Like an Iron Hills or something like that, right? Even the same fight value with really high defense, it's not like completely, without flaw. But yeah, I think Charles, to your point, that's a really common like alliance that I've seen talked about. I've never played against it, but on the East Coast too is like it's so hard to like fully appreciate this until you've played with this army. But like the Master, Braga, and Alfred fully maxed out is 42 models, including the heroes. And it's 341 points. So like to Richard's point of like, man, how did you get all those models in there? Like that's 40 like you just drop 40, 42 models into any list, right? And it's going to be pretty strong. So that's another thing I've seen, Charles, is like Army of Laketown with the banner effect, and then like Galadriel, regular Galadriel allied in from Lothlorien with a ton of like guards of the court. So now you're fight 6, with 50, 60 models at probably even like 600 points. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with this list. I'd be curious to hear you guys if you take this type of force, even a Yellow Alliance at like 800 points. I don't think it's going to do as well as you think. I do think it struggles a little bit more for the reasons that I mentioned. Depends how you build it, of course, but I really think like the lower points range is where this is like a real kind of powerhouse army.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of the weaknesses we talked about, you'll be able to see them quite a bit more at 800 points. So definitely don't agree with what you've said. So yeah, I wouldn't take this to an 800 point tournament, except for maybe for fun. But yeah, I think like you said, lower points levels where it's at.
I mean, just throwing Guai here, 150 points.
I'm talking about pure. I wouldn't take it pure above like 600.
Yeah, fair. I mean, I was just thinking 650 points. Just tack on a perfect 150, right? 43 models, not too bad. I mean, it's a bit of glass cannon, but.
Yeah, but you've got an 18-inch compel and a giant flying monster, so like.
Alistair took that at a recent event, and we do good versus evil, so I think he only played it maybe one round, but he did basically the same core and Saruman and Guai here. That was his combo, to have like the wizard to slow people down and like the big monster. Like I said, he's one of the best players in our area, so there's a lot you can do. I mean, you could take the bears and throw them in here. You could take like any hero pretty much can ally with this army. So you've got a lot of flexibility, even like Glorfindel, right? Like if you wanted a stronger leader that's more defensive with the heroic strike, fight 7, and a bunch of, high fight elves, like this army's, I think, like there's more to it than initially you would see just from looking at the few pages.
Well, Andrew, thank you for coming back to the podcast and talking to us about the Army of Laketown. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys. This was a blast.
Thanks to all our viewers for tuning in. Look forward to the next episode of Into the West podcast.